starting off today by talking about one sits and a little bit of like news current stuff, but also some of the rhetoric that I was hearing yesterday was just absurd, particularly in comparisons to events like 9/11 in Pearl Harbor. Now, the reason I think it's important to talk about this is they are trying to generate war hysteria. That's why they're using comparisons to those two events. And so, and obviously, if those two events actually had anywhere near the casualties or significance of one sits, we wouldn't even remember them or use them as comparisons. If you just look at the people who actually died on one sits, it's three Trump supporters dying of medical issues, and then Trump supporter Ashley Babbitt who dies crawling through a window. Now, on that shooting, I still stand by, what I originally said, that it wasn't necessary, that, they could have arrested this woman without shooting her. And I always think that is preferable. However, if you are crawling through a window and there's a guy with a gun there that's separating you and the congressman, I wouldn't, I would expect that they're going to start pulling the trigger. And to be honest, as much as there were actions by the cops that day that I think escalated the amount of violence, and there was unnecessarily violence by police officers, I guess, I wouldn't have been surprised that the cops use a whole lot more force. And so, that is a part of it, is particularly lethal force. I'm surprised a little bit they didn't start shooting people at different times when they were trying to enter the Capitol, like through breaking windows. So I think, calling it like an insurrection or a coup is obviously like way too hysterical and overstating what happened. At the same time, if you're just saying that it's a protest, then that's not like it was a riot. People were attacking police officers. They did break into windows of the U.S. Capitol building and were ultimately able to delay a ceremonial vote to coordinate Biden as president by a couple of hours, I suppose. So overall, it's not that big of an event, other than essentially, the fact that some windows are broken. There was some trash left around. There really wasn't that much vandalism, other than breaking things to get into various areas. It's not like people were spray painting or burning things inside the Capitol or anything like that. And so, this really wasn't an insurrection or anything like that, but certainly there was a chain of events that led to people acting violently. And, at times it was the Trump supporters that were responsible for provoking the violence, right? It's not just that, police were pepper spraying people for no reason, and then people were responding with pepper spray or hitting cops, which, all these things had happened throughout the US in 2020. And so watching them, on one sits, especially the events outside of the Capitol, nothing was really surprising if you had watched any of the other coverage of protests around the U.S. in the past year, other than maybe this was happening at the Capitol. Although even then, the Black Lives Matter protests in D.C. Were, harassed far more, but also, we're doing violent things towards the officers as well. And so, again, not trying to completely dismiss the significance of the protest, but let's try to put it into some context here. Now, because this was the Capitol, not surprised, bunch of people, hundreds of people being charged. They say 725 people in total have been arrested, and the Department of Justice, the FBI, is looking for another 350 people. Most of these people are on misdemeanor charges of like trespassing. I think there's like some kind of charge for disrupting congressional proceedings or something like that. 22% of the 175 have pled guilty to misdemeanor charges. 20 people have pled guilty to felony charges. And in 4 cases, they were significant charges for attacking police officers. And so this guy, Robert Scott Palmer, he's the guy that threw the fire extinguisher at police officers. If you'll remember, not on 1/6, but the day after, it began reported that there was an officer that was in the, intensive care unit or whatever, fighting for his life. And I believe on the 8th, Brian Sitnick actually dies. That's the officer, but it's either on the 7th or the 8th that he dies. And but it was initially like conflated, these two stories, saying that Palmer had thrown a fire extinguisher at Brian Sitnick and that had been what led to his death. That wasn't the case at all. And if you were listening to this show back in 2021, September 20 or January 2021, you would have known right away that didn't happen. I was skeptical from the beginning and had plenty of good reason to be, that there was not an officer who was violently murdered on 1/6, and I turned out to be 100% right on that, even though that got some real slander thrown my way all over the place, YouTube, Twitter, and stuff like that. People were very upset, but 100% vindicated. Brian Sitnick, biomedical coroner, died of a stroke medical episode, not from anything that happened on the sits. He was apparently maced with something, but went home and was fine. Now, there are some things that don't get talked about from the sits that I think are really important. The first is the pipe bomb, which is the reason that a lot of high-profile people were actually evacuated and things, not talking about Mike Pence or some of the members of Congress, but particularly like Kamala Harris. And I believe this was also the reason the police officer was looking for AOC and why she was like on lockdown in her office, was because of the pipe bomb that was planted outside of a political office. And so there's still no idea who carried out or who planted that pipe bomb or anything like that, which seems like it should be one of the bigger things discussed and one of the real demands to figure out what the hell was going on there. But there's really no talk of that. And then also, I gotta mention that you have all these people either in Congress or, elected officials now, but particularly the members of Congress who talking about fearing for their lives and things like that. And, I feel how you feel about them fearing for their lives, but they really were not able to take up any perspective of what they do, how many people, millions, hundreds of millions of people around the world that they may fear for their lives with their policy decisions. And it happened to them once, and they want to make it out to be the most traumatic thing that ever happened in the entire world, but have no perspective. And on that day, look, nobody who was defending them or anything was killed, or even right there were pretty brutal beatings of police officers. That guy outside with the flag or the stick or whatever, he's slamming it on the officer's head. The guy that threw the fire extinguisher at the officers, these are serious weapons that they're using. They, in the right circumstances, could have killed someone, but didn't actually really come close in any sense. So for you to then say, oh, I feared for my life, and to stand by that a year later seems rather absurd. But even if you're standing by that, to not have the perspective of, if that trauma meant that much to you, imagine what our foreign policy is doing to other people of, the people of Yemen or Afghanistan, who are constantly living under far more, the people around them actually die from U.S. bombs, right? They have real reason to fear the U.S. war state, whether it's the Saudis or the Americans dropping the bombs, or the Iraqi military, whatever, whatever country is dropping the American-made bombs and the American-made fighter planes authorized by the U.S. president and the U.S. foreign policy, that's that's another level of terror. But there's no perspective on that, how much that must hurt those people and impact their lives. It's just, it doesn't get discussed or whatsoever. And it kind of makes me think that this is theater and they're really just pretending, or else if they have real trauma, they might have some empathy with other people who are being put through and experiencing that trauma. So let's see, the last one I think I have here is, of course, Riot and the narrative that is put forward by not, just right-wing media, but that's a somewhat coherent narrative. If you read the Revolver pieces, they ask questions, they don't have full answers, but real questions about this guy Ray Epps and how much of what happened on One Sits was the actions of a coordinated group, and what, I guess, connections that coordinated group has to any other actor. They mainly mention like the FBI or something like that, like these were dupes in a FBI stooge plot or something like that. But at the same time, these could have been henchmen of John Bannon or Steve Bannon or something like that, right? It doesn't necessarily have to mean if they were in a conspiracy, it would be a conspiracy that helps the Trump narrative. But if there's a couple pieces at Revolver on this, but if you want, you could just go and find all the information on Ray Epps by pretty much just putting his name in the Twitter search, and there's a lot of hashtags around it. But also, if you look through the Revolver piece, click on the links, you could find all the video, far more video that you need just to understand. But really, to see that before the day on 1/5, the day before this event, he was out there calling for people to go into the Capitol. What we gotta do is go into the Capitol. He's at the Capitol building before Trump has even called on people or finished speaking to go to the Capitol. And so, it's not necessarily obvious that he would be acting at the behest of Trump. You see him at several points outside of the Capitol. And so, the Capitol grounds are pretty large, and there's barricades set up around them manned by just a couple of officers. And so you see him at two of these places, at least, having conversations, or at least short even interactions would maybe be also a way to describe it, with two or three people who eventually instigate taking down these barriers. It's also important to note that after these barriers are taken down, they're hidden. And so if you're just approaching the Capitol, and I think on a normal day, there wouldn't be barriers in these locations. And so after Trump finishes speaking and tells people to go to the Capitol, there are people who then leave who couldn't have known that these barriers ever existed because they were taken down before Trump finished speaking, and they left, right? So who is Ray Epps, and why hasn't he been arrested and charged? Who is he connected to? There's a lot of questions around him and some of the Oath Keeper members. Also, this guy who was on the tower who kept demanding that people push forward. And again, I don't want to get into all this, and I'm not exactly convinced by this narrative that, maybe there was some kind of FBI plot or something behind this. But there are some real questions about people who are heavily involved in instigating violence on the sits who haven't been arrested or charged, and figuring out why they were doing what they're doing, I think is really important to understanding what happened on the 6th. So that's most of what I have on the memorial and everything of it. I really hate the way that this is being handled by elected officials, basically on both sides. There are some people who have decent takes on it, but a lot of the pro-Trump Republicans are just completely trying to dismiss it or really push beyond even what the author at the Revolver piece is stating in his piece, that this was for sure some kind of anti-Trump conspiracy, or to mention that Trump had nothing to do with it. Even if you can't say freedom of speech and all that, there were things that Trump could have done to de-escalate that situation. And from reading various stories, and while they are all published at the Washington Post, they do talk about interactions that people had with Trump, before Ashley Babbitt was killed, telling Trump to tell these people to calm down because they would listen to him. Now, it's 100% possible that they would have reacted they reacted when Donald Trump told them to give the booster or something like that, and just boo him and continue on with what they're doing. Because I do think in a lot of ways the Trump movement is far bigger than Trump, and people who just put it as a whole Trump cult of personality really misunderstand what happened in 2016 and in 2020. but it probably would have helped to de-escalate the situation for a lot of people. A lot of people there, were Trump sycophants, and if Trump said go home, they probably would have. And after Trump did tell people to go home, I think they were kind of already at that point. After the shooting of Ashley Babbitt, a lot of people, it was like, we're just like, oh, this is real and don't want to die. And if it was a real coup attempt, they're probably willing to die for it. They weren't willing to die, and so they all just went home. And Trump put out the tweets and everything like that. But Trump could have done far more to de-escalate the situation here and to protect his people in that sense. The people dying there were Trump's people, and so had Trump told them to turn back, maybe Ashley Babbitt wouldn't have died. And that's not necessarily to say that Trump is more responsible for her death than the cop that shot her or anything like that. But, Trump, he's the president of the United States, man. At that time, he has a lot of power. And when people are dying in his name, he has a way to prevent it. So all that on one sits. Also want to mention here that the Capitol Police Force wants to hire an additional 840 officers. Look, if there's just a bunch of cops standing around or on reserve in case like a bunch of people show up at the Capitol building again, that's one thing, but I don't think that's what this is. The Capitol Police have vastly expanded their powers. They're putting offices and police departments all over the country. This is a part of the domestic war on terror, as I talked about in the beginning of all this. They're comparing this to 9/11, Pearl Harbor, because this is war rhetoric, because they're changing the game and expanding the domestic war on terror. It's no longer just about Muslims. They're really looking at and to target white supremacists. And so they've given the Capitol Police a lot of power. Of course, members of Congress spend billions, trillions of dollars a year. They're constantly screwing people, ruining people's business and everything like that. And not to mention, this is a country of 300 plus million people. And so I could say from my personal, professional job experience that, there are crazy people, who we call crazy, but people who have mental illness who are either misunderstood or delusional, but mean absolutely no harm, and who call different congressmen and will say, like, if you do this, your children will regret it. And while if you talk to them, they may say, well, yeah, this is gonna harm the environment and that's gonna make her children regret it, but the way it sounds and everything like that. So there are those situations, but also people do have their lives ruined by the policies of Congress. And I'm sure people get, really upset and will call a member of Congress or will post like a inappropriate meme or an inappropriate statement on Twitter advocating violence. And I think the plan of the Capitol Police with these additional officers is to start to investigate and to look into all of this. And I think it's going to come and probably, even if it starts just very close to the line, it definitely will exceed the line and start to violate our free speech and everything like that. And they'll any criticism of a congressman, especially whoever's decided to be the protected party at that time, you criticizing them could get you a visit from a Capitol Police will really tone down people's criticism.